All right, Sumer S. Ickeman should begin soon. The Reading Rota. Okay, so you can see that's definitely an example of polyphony where you have multiple voices singing different pieces. So, compositional complexities. In the 14th century, notational innovations yet again opened the door to new possibilities. Theorists and composers developed mensuration or measurement systems in which different notes were used, ancestors of the different symbols used for today's note values. A new way of measuring the rhythm also employed a new tool, the forebears of today's time signatures. One of those symbols is still in use, the large capital C, known as common time. Cumulatively, these were dramatic changes, and the historian Douglas Seaton noted it is important to stress the epoch making significances of the leap of creative imagination that made possible mensural notation. To abandon the domination of the number three in musical rhythm required an intellectual boldness, comparable to that of Newton, Darwin, or Einstein. It also depended on the decline of the ecclesiastical authority and on an increasing tendency to view music as an autonomous realm rather than a reflection of spiritual or philosophical ideas. Equipped with these new devices, composers started crafting extremely complicated pieces. Not only did each voice usually have an independent rhythm, but sometimes each singer sang a different text. Occasionally, texts were in different languages. So the era that produced such complex works is called Ars Nova, New Art, borrowing from the label of two different medieval manuscripts that each use the term. Perhaps the most outstanding composer of the Ars Nova was Guillaume de Marchaux. Not only did he write sophisticated and beautiful works for the Catholic Church, he was also a skilled poet, writing his own texts when crafting secular music. And sometimes Marchaux employed devices such as the canon, but he also incorporated other puzzles, such as the one found in Ma fin est mon commencement, My end is my beginning. The top voice sings a melody, while the middle voice sings the same melody in reverse. Another voice sings a melody that ends halfway through the piece and then sings his melody backward. Medieval musical media. The overwhelming majority of pieces that survive contain poetry alongside whatever notation system was in use. Occasionally, though, some music has no text at all, implying it might have been intended for instruments. Some of these situations occur in sacred pieces, when an organ or some other instrument played on these notes. It surprises people who are familiar with Catholic churches today to learn that organs were initially banned in the early Christian churches since they were associated with the ancient Roman circuses. And of course, Christians had suffered greatly during those circuses. However, churches began to include organs at least by ninth century. And as Douglas Seaton points out, the existence of documents by church authorities banning instruments from churches implies that improvised performance on instruments also took place. Other textless compositions were clearly meant for dancing, sometimes using medieval terms for particular dance styles such as the estampe, stamping dance. Medieval music does not indicate what instruments were to play the melodies, but sometimes paintings or tapestries depict small groups of instruments alongside the dancers. We know that instruments in the Middle Ages were sorted into loud and soft categories, with loud instruments being reserved for outdoor use or very large halls. Nevertheless, performing medieval music on instruments today requires a great deal of guesswork. So, the access to music. In today's world of 24/7 availability of music via many, many means, it's easy to forget that such convenience was not always the case. In fact, it's only a recent development. Music making in earlier eras took place in more specialized circumstances. It should be evident that one of the best locations to hear music in the Middle Ages was the Catholic Church. Every Mass and all the offices involved considerable amounts of singing. It is not clear, though, how much instrumental music would have been included in these services. Another place to hear musical performance in the Middle Ages was the courts of aristocrats and the nobility. Music was needed for courtly dancing and as entertainment during banquets and festivals. As people outside the church began to master the new techniques of writing music down, more and more secular songs began to be preserved for posterity, using the same complex rhythmic devices the church had developed. And in courts, aristocrats spent their leisure time developing their skills as poet composers, writing chansons, French songs about love, military prowess, and other concerns of chivalry. In the south of France, these artists were known as troubadours. In the north, they were called trouvères. England's King Richard the Lionheart, who never learned to speak English, was one of the earliest trouvères, although the music from only one of his songs survives, Je ne prie, No Man Who's in Prison. Certainly music must have played a role in the lives of the lower social classes, but since many people were illiterate, their music was not preserved. As with the courtly entertainments, some evidence about music making among the lower social classes is available in visual art. And similar to some of the deductive reasoning concerning instruments in church, there are surviving documents from church authorities that scolded people against ballads and dancing and evil and wanton songs and such like lures of the devil. Clear cut evidence that singing and dancing must have been ongoing. Okay, so summary. Ancient civilizations used musical notation, but we don't know how to interpret them. Roman Empire controlled most of Europe. Feudalism was the first system to re-establish control over society. Catholic Church grew steadily in power, ultimately led by a Roman pope. Several Roman emperors became Christians. Later, various Frankish French rulers allied themselves with the church. 8th century French king Charlemagne valued education, remember, Alcuin of York, and required the church schools to include music in the curriculum. His former tutor, Alcuin, developed a system of higher education which positions music as one of the arts. An emphasis encouraged the development of universities. 5th century authority St. Augustine declares music enhances the impact of religious texts. Don't forget, he's the one who wrote Confessions. Medieval universities taught students various aspects of speculative theory, that music controlled movement of stars and planets, music was the balance between body and soul, and the acoustic principles. Catholic Church developed a system of daily worship called the liturgy. Within that, there were the masses and offices, ordinary and proper. Many of the items in the liturgy were set to a monophonic chant or plain chant, sometimes known as Gregorian chant because of Pope Gregory I. And when the Pope and Frankish rulers wanted to distribute chant melodies, notation was needed. Earliest technique for notation were the neumes. Then Guido of Arezzo is the first practical theorist, introduces the musical staff, employs psalmization syllables. He develops the Guidonian hand. The composers of chant employed syllabic text setting when they assigned one note to each syllable, but they would decorate each syllable with extra notes, and that's melismatic text setting. The item for Mass called the Hallelujah features an elaborate melismatic text setting called the Jubilus. Later composers added new syllables to the jubilus called troping. A famous sequence for a funeral mass is the Dies Irae. Medieval composers developed square notations, and these achievements characterized the medieval style that was called Ars Antiqua. Ars Antiqua composers began to use polyphony. Earliest forms was parallel organum, followed by oblique and free organum. And when different rhythms were added to each melody, complex pieces were feasible. A rondellus is for two voices as a foundation, or a pes, with a rota or canon for six upper voices. With further refinements to note shapes and the invention of a way to indicate time signature, composers developed mensuration or measurement. Works in this style is the Ars Nova. And nearly all surviving medieval music was written for voices, although few pieces without text may have been intended for instruments. Earliest surviving music was sacred, but then notational techniques were used to secular music, especially chanson. The aristocratic poet composers of southern France were the troubadours, and in the north of France and in England, they were called trouvères. And little information is available about music that entertained lower classes. Since all the poorest were nearly illiterate, none of their music was preserved in written form.